The night was not fit for a confession, but he made one anyway. Rain drove hard against the tall windows of Cavendrew Hall, and the candles guttered in their sconces as the Duke of Arresthaven stood before his wife with a letter in his hand and ice where his reason should have been. "You will leave this house before morning." Catherine did not cry. She had been raised by a woman who said tears were wasted on men who had already decided, and so she stood very still in her ivory dressing gown, one hand pressed flat against her abdomen, and looked at her husband with an expression he would spend 5 years trying to forget. Westley, his name in her mouth, low and without plea. "I am with child. The child is not mine." 3 words. He said them. The way a judge reads a sentence, not with cruelty, but with the terrible finality of a man who believes himself to be merely accurate. The letter he held contained her forged signature, a rendezvous, a name she did not recognize. Dates she could not refute because she had been ill those weeks and had no witnesses but the servants, and the servants, it would later emerge, had been paid. She looked at the letter once. Then she looked at him. "Then God help you," she said, "when the truth finds you." He did not answer. He rang for the housekeeper. By dawn, Catherine Voss, Duchess of Arresthaven, was gone. Turned out into a November storm with one trunk, her wedding ring returned to the mantle, and a child beginning to form beneath her heart. Westley Voss, 8th Duke of Arresthaven, stood at the window and watched the carriage disappear. He told himself he felt nothing. He was wrong. Before we continue, if stories of betrayal, hidden truths, and second chances are the reason you watch channels like this, consider subscribing to the Plum Court. Every subscription helps bring more of these powerful historical dramas to life, and it ensures you won't miss the moment when this story's truth finally comes to light. The Duchy of Arresthaven sat on the northern face of a high chalk ridge overlooking the Dorset coast, its great house visible from the fishing villages below like a pale crown refusing to bow to the sea. Westley Voss had inherited the title at 19 upon the sudden death of his father, a man whose portrait hung in the long gallery with the same hard jaw and the same grey eyes that had never, in the history of the family, been known to soften in company. He was 32 when he married Catherine. She was 23, the youngest daughter of a minor baronet in Wiltshire, unremarkable in fortune, remarkable in nearly everything else. She had her father's intelligence and her mother's stubbornness. She read Latin for pleasure. She spoke her mind with the precision of someone who has considered the cost and decided to pay it. And she had a habit of looking directly at people who expected to be looked past. Westley had not expected to want her. He had expected to manage her. He had been wrong about that too. Their 18 months of marriage had been marked by a tension that was not unhappiness. Something more like 2 strong currents finding the same channel, sometimes flowing together, sometimes pushing back. He had admired her. She had challenged him. The household staff had called it, in whispers, a real marriage. Then came his brother Aldous. Aldous Voss was younger by 6 years, charming in the particular way of men who have never needed to be sincere, and deeply, quietly furious that the duchy was not his. He had cultivated patience like a gardener cultivates something that takes years to bloom. He waited until Catherine was 8 weeks with child. Then he delivered the letters. 5 years later, Trentmarrow Bay, Cornwall. The village of Trentmarrow Bay clung to its cliff like something that had been dropped there and decided to stay. Its harbour smelled of salt and rendered tallow. Its main street ran crooked between a chandler's and a public house called the Anchor and Crow, and its residents had the mild suspicion of outsiders, common to communities that survive by knowing exactly who belongs. Katrina Wells, as she was known here, belonged. She had arrived 5 years ago in February, with a single trunk, a name she had borrowed from her grandmother, and the careful, closed expression of a woman who has been through something she does not intend to discuss. She had paid 3 months' rent in advance on a stone cottage at the top of the harbour lane, set up her sewing table in the front room, and begun. That was all. She had simply begun. She was 28 now. Brown hair that she kept braided and pinned without ceremony. Hands calloused at the fingertips from the needle. Eyes that were dark and direct in the way of someone accustomed to assessing situations quickly. She wore plain wool and good boots and moved through the village with the unhurried certainty of a woman who knows every cobblestone by its name. She was not happy. Exactly. She was something sturdier than happy. Useful, purposeful, known. And there was Leo. Her son was 4 years old when they had arrived, and now he was 9, bright and narrow-shouldered and perpetually in motion, with a habit of asking questions before the previous answer had fully settled. He had silver eyes the colour of a winter sea, and an old burn scar on his left forearm from a kitchen accident the previous year that he wore, inexplicably, with pride. He had his father's eyes. Katrina tried not to think about that. This morning, she was delivering a finished morning gown to the vicar's wife, Leo trotting alongside her with a paper packet of pins she'd asked him to carry, when she noticed a rider come fast down the cliff road. Not a local horse, not a local seat. She watched him pass without expression. That evening, she wrote 3 words in the margins of her account ledger, between the figures for thread and the cost of black crepe. He is near. She crossed them out. Then she turned to her accounts, and she did not think about Cavendrew Hall, and she did not think about a man's voice saying, "The child is not mine," and she put another log on the fire and went on. The Wesley Voss, who sat inside the disabled carriage on the Trentmarrow Road at 3:30 in the afternoon, was not a man much given to inconvenience, and so inconvenience had found him as punishment. The rear axle had cracked on the coast road's worst rut. His driver was under the carriage assessing what could not be repaired before dark. His manservant Croft was attempting to find a local to hire a horse, and the Duke sat with one long leg crossed over the other and an expression of constrained displeasure that had, over years of practice, become simply his face. He was 37. He looked older in the way that men look older when they have held a grief in the jaw rather than in the eyes. Tight, controlled, contained. His hair was dark with the first grey at the temples. He wore travel clothes without ornament, which on him still managed to convey the impression of ornament. And he had not smiled since somewhere around Exeter. He had not, if he was being precise about it, smiled properly since November of 1842. He was travelling to Gardenwick, the estate of his solicitor, one Mr. Edwin Crail, who had been managing the Arresthaven legal affairs with quiet efficiency for 4 years now, and who had written, 2 weeks prior, a letter containing the words, "There is a matter of some delicacy requiring your personal attention." This was Edwin's way of saying something had gone badly wrong. Wesley had been in no hurry. He was in no hurry because Cavendrew Hall had been very quiet for 5 years, and the quiet had worked on him in the way that silence works on stone. Slowly, invisibly, until the damage is already deep. He had not searched for her. This was the thing he could not say and could not stop knowing. He had believed the letters. He had expelled his wife into a storm. He had then, and this was the part that visited him in the grey hours before dawn, he had then conducted an inquiry lasting all of 3 days before deciding the matter was settled. Croft returned. A horse could be hired from a farm at the village bottom. The village name? Wesley asked. Trentmarrow Bay, Your Grace. Wesley looked out at the cliff road, at the pale winter light lying flat on the sea below. Very well. The Anchor and Crow on a Tuesday evening was not fashionable. It was warm, and it smelled of wood smoke and salted fish, and old Bramwell, the landlord, kept the pewter clean and the fire stoked, and this was sufficient. Leo Wells was not supposed to be there. His mother had sent him with a finished parcel for Mrs. Bramwell, a repaired bodice and 2 new collars, and he had delivered the parcel and collected the coin and had been firmly on his way out when he had seen the chess pieces on the corner table and sat down to study them instead, in the way that children make instantaneous and entirely inconvenient decisions. He was sitting cross-legged on the settle, turning a rook over in his hands, when the door opened. The Duke of Arresthaven walked into the Anchor and Crow. He filled the doorway the way large men fill doorways, without effort and with the particular inconvenience of someone who does not notice they're doing it. He was mud-spattered from the road and asking Bramwell for hot food and a room for the night, and Bramwell was nodding rapidly in the manner of a man who has correctly identified that his visitor is quality and is very pleased about it. Leo looked up. Wesley looked across the room and found a child's face looking at him, and the thought that crossed his mind was too fast and too strange to catch cleanly. It was something between recognition and vertigo, the feeling of standing on a threshold and not being sure which side of the door you are on. The boy had silver eyes. Wesley's family had silver eyes. His father had had them. He had them. His mother had once said they were God's way of marking the Voss men, so no one could misplace them. He told himself it meant nothing. He looked away. Bramwell called to the back, and a woman emerged from the kitchen corridor. A woman in a plain grey dress with a brown braid and calloused hands, carrying a fresh tallow candle and moving with the kind of unhurried competence that meant she was not a guest but known here. She looked at the room. She saw the stranger. For one instant, the thinnest interval of time, barely long enough to measure, something passed over Katrina Wells's face like a shadow over water. Then she said, "Leo, come." and her son slid off the settle without argument, and she steered him toward the door with a hand at his shoulder, and she did not look at the Duke again. Wesley turned. But they were already gone. He stood at the bar, with his meal untouched, looking at the door, with a feeling in his chest he had no respectable name for. He asked Bramwell about the woman in the grey dress. Casually, the way a man asks about the weather in a new place, as though the answer has no consequence. That's Katrina Wells, Bramwell said, refilling the mug. Seamstress. Been here 5 years, near enough. Widow, though she doesn't talk on it. The boy's Leo. Good lad. The boy's father? Bramwell tilted his chin. Died before they came here, so the story goes. She doesn't say more, and I don't ask. Wesley nodded as though satisfied. He was not satisfied. He ate alone in the corner with the feeling of a man who has been handed a puzzle piece from a box he thought he had locked and buried. The boy's face stayed in his mind with the persistence of something refusing to be dismissed. The precise silver of those eyes, the angle of the jaw, the way the child had looked up at him with a directness that had nothing of shyness in it. Your family's eyes, said a voice in him that he had spent 5 years silencing. They are your family's eyes. He dismissed it. He was still dismissing it when he rose at 6 the following morning, still dismissing it as Croft reported the axle could be repaired by noon, and still dismissing it as he walked down the harbour lane in the thin early light to clear his head. He found Katrina Wells at the end of the lane, sitting on the harbour wall with a piece of mending in her lap and the grey sea behind her, working in the early light with her back to him. He stopped. She spoke without turning. You are blocking the light, sir. He stepped aside. He did not leave. After a moment she turned and looked at him, fully, openly, the way people look when they have decided that pretending not to see is more trouble than it is worth. Her face was composed, with the absolute determination of someone whose composure is something she has built, rather than inherited. You were in the Anchor last evening, she said. Yes. Are you unwell? You stared at my son, Wesley said with the honesty of a man who finds it easier than tact. He has remarkable eyes. A pause. The sea moved below them. Yes, she said quietly, he does. She turned back to her mending. Her hands were steady. The needle moved in and out of the fabric without tremor. But her jaw, he noticed it, had tightened by the smallest degree. She knew he had noticed, and he knew that she knew. I am Wesley Voss, he said. The needle stopped. 1 second. 2. Then it moved again. I know who you are, Katrina Wells said. Good morning, Your Grace. She did not run. This was the discipline of 5 years. She did not run. She did not weep. She did not allow the hands to shake in view of anyone who might read the shaking. She finished the hem she was working, folded the mending into her basket, wished the Duke of Aristhaven a formal good morning, and walked back up the harbour lane to her cottage, with the gait of a woman who is going nowhere in particular. Inside, with the door latched, she set the basket down and stood very still in the centre of her front room. Leo was still asleep. She could hear him. She counted his breath through the thin wall. 1, 2, 3, until the sound of it became a floor beneath her feet again. She had known this was possible. She had known, in the remote theoretical way one knows that ships sink and roofs fall and pestilence travels in the bellies of rats, that he might find her or she might be found. She had even, in the long nights of the first year, when the fear had been sharper, rehearsed what she would do. She had not rehearsed this particular flavour of it. She had not rehearsed what it would feel like to watch his face in the moment he looked at Leo, because she had seen it, that lightning flash of recognition, the vertigo, the almost knowing, and she had seen him push it down. She had watched a man come within a breath of the truth and choose not to breathe in. 5 years ago that would have broken her. Now she made tea. She made tea, and she sat at her table, and she thought with the same methodical precision she brought to her accounts. He was travelling. He would leave. The axle was being repaired. He had no reason to linger. She had Leo to think of. She had her work. She had her life, which was small and complete and entirely her own. Then why does your hand tremble on the cup, Catherine? She set the cup down. She did not have an answer, but she noted the tremor as one notes a fault line, with attention and without panic, and she filed it where she kept such things. Then she went to wake Leo, because Tuesday was his arithmetic morning, and he had a tendency to hide under the blanket until compelled otherwise. Edwin Crail was 34 years old, slight, quiet, with the fine-boned face of a man who reads more than he speaks, and the particular stillness of someone who has learned that being underestimated is strategically useful. He had arrived in Trentmarrow Bay 14 months ago to settle the estate of a deceased local merchant, found the village worth staying in, and opened a small legal practice above the chandler's. He did not advertise. People found him by word of mouth, which in a village meant he had more work than he could comfortably manage by the end of his 3rd month. Katrina Wells had come to him about her tenancy agreement. He had read the document, identified 3 clauses the landlord had inserted without her awareness, and renegotiated them on her behalf without charging her, because the clauses were predatory, and she was clearly a woman of careful intelligence who had simply not known what she was looking at. She had looked at him afterward with an expression he would later recognize as her assessment face. The look she gave things she was not yet sure she trusted, and said very precisely, "Why?" "Because the clauses were wrong," he said, "and you needed someone to say so." She had nodded. She had come back 3 weeks later with a question about her cottage lease, then again about Leo's school fees, then about a letter from a London creditor she did not recognize. He had handled each matter. He had not pressed for information she did not offer. He had not asked about the boy's father or the absent husband or the careful sealed quality of her history. He had simply been useful and available and correct. Now, she sat across his desk with the news that the Duke of Aristhaven was in the village, and her face was doing the thing it did when she was very frightened and refusing to show it. He saw Leo, she said. Edwin kept his hands flat on the desk. He had learned not to reach for her in distress, because she found it intrusive. Did he recognize? I don't know. Possibly. The eyes. A pause. Give his name. He told you his name. Yes. He knows yours. Not yet. He knows Katrina Wells. Her chin lifted by a degree. I need to understand what he can do, Mr. Crail. Legally. If he suspects, if he decides to investigate, what power does he have over Leo? Edwin was quiet for a moment, because the question had several answers, and only one of them was uncomplicated. That, he said, depends on what he knows and what he can prove. Then we should understand that before he does. It was not a request. He looked at her, at the steadiness she wore like armor, at the exhaustion living just behind the steadiness. And he felt the particular kind of respect that comes from watching someone hold an impossible weight without asking to set it down. Yes, he said, we should. He reached for his pen. Wesley had not intended to stay. The axle was repaired by 1 in the afternoon. Croft had the carriage ready. Gardenwick was 2 hours' ride north. Edwin Crail, his solicitor, was expecting him. All reasons to leave. He stayed. He told Croft he wished to walk the cliff road and take the air, which was true in the way that half-truths are true. He walked north along the cliff path, where the sea beat against chalk the color of old bone and the wind came off the water with the clean, salt-edged persistence of something that has never been indoors, and he tried to think through what he was doing. He was not searching for her. He was certain of this. He was walking. It was on the path back, as the light was going amber and low, that he encountered the dog. It was a large, pale-coated retriever of advanced years, stiff at the hindquarters, grey around the muzzle, with the unhurried dignity of a dog that has made its peace with the world and expects the world to accommodate it in return. It sat in the middle of the cliff path and regarded Westley with the mild authority of an old judge. Westley, who had no particular opinion of dogs, stopped. The dog did not move. He stepped to the right. The dog shifted right. He stepped left. The dog shifted left. He stood with his hands in his coat pockets looking at an elderly retriever that appeared to have decided to bar the coast road, and the absurdity of it, the sheer, mundane, irreducible absurdity, after 5 years of nothing remotely like absurdity, caught him so completely off guard that something moved in his face without his permission. Not a smile. Something prior to a smile. The memory of a muscle he had stopped using. Move, he told the dog. The dog lifted its head and looked past him. Westley turned. Leo Wells was 40 feet down the path, running with the particular confidence of a child navigating familiar ground, calling, "Copperwick, Copper, come," and then he stopped dead when he saw the Duke. The two of them stood looking at one another in the amber coast light. The dog thumped its tail once against the path and looked back and forth between them with an expression of great satisfaction, as though it had arranged exactly this. "He's mine," Leo said, with the directness of a child asserting territory. "He got out. He was blocking the road," Wesley said. "He does that." A pause. The boy studied him. "You were at the Anchor last night." "Yes, you were looking at me." Wesley regarded the child, 9 years old. Silver eyes. The jaw still soft with childhood, but the bone beneath it carrying a shape he had seen in the long gallery of Cavendrew Hall for 30 years. "You have unusual eyes," he said for the second time, because it was the truest thing he was able to say. Leo considered this. "My mother says they're my father's," he said simply. "She says I never knew him. He died." A silence opened between them, wide as the sea behind it. "I am sorry for that," Wesley said, and he meant it in more ways than Leo could know. The boy shrugged, the quick, unsentimental shrug of a child who has reached an accommodation with a fact. He called Copperwick, who rose and ambled obligingly to his side, and turned back toward the village. Then he stopped. "Your name is Voss," Leo said, without turning around. "I heard Bramwell say it." "Yes." The boy stood very still for a moment, his back to the Duke. "Then, that was my mother's name before." He walked away down the cliff path. Westley stood in the amber light with the sea below him and the weight of 5 years landing all at once, and the word before ringing in his ears like a bell that had been struck and would not stop. He did not go to Gardenwick that evening. He sent Croft ahead with a note for Edwin Crail, delayed by road, expect me Thursday, and took a room at the Anchor for a second night, and sat at the small desk in the corner with a candle and the thing Leo had said, turning it over. That was my mother's name, before. He was not a sentimental man, and he was not ordinarily an impulsive one. He had built his adult life on deliberation, on the iron patience of a man who had been given too much power too young, and had decided that caution was the only responsible response to that power. He had been deliberate the night he expelled Catherine. He had taken 3 days. He had read the letters twice. He had questioned a servant. He had deliberated. The deliberation had destroyed her. He sat in the candlelight and let himself, for the first time in 5 years, follow the thought he had been refusing to follow. What if the letters were false? It was not new as a thought. It had appeared before. In the months immediately after, when the silence of Cavendrew Hall had been a kind of accusation, and he had put it away because to entertain it was to begin a door that, once opened, could not be closed. The door was open now. A 9-year-old boy had opened it with 8 words on a cliff path. He reached for paper. He wrote a letter to his man of affairs in London. A letter containing very specific instructions and the phrase "I wish to know," with precision, the provenance of documents delivered to me in November 1842. He sealed it. He gave it to Bramwell to add to the Morning Post. Then he opened his travelling case and removed a small iron box, flat, the size of a book, that had lived in the bottom of his travelling luggage for 4 years. Inside it was a letter he had never opened. It had arrived 3 weeks after he had sent Catherine away, addressed in a hand he had not recognized, postmarked from a village in Wiltshire. He had put it in the iron box because he could not open it and could not destroy it, which told him something he had not been ready to hear. He opened it now. It was not from Catherine. It was from her maid, a woman named Price, who had accompanied Catherine to Wiltshire and then, apparently, left her service. It was a single page, precisely worded, and it said 4 things. That Catherine had never been to the house named in the letters. That the dates given were dates she had been confined to bed with fever. That the groom who had testified to seeing her leave at night had received, in that same period, a payment of £40, and that the letters themselves had been given to the Duke's steward by a man Price, described as resembling very closely, in face and bearing, the Duke's own younger brother, Mr. Aldous Voss. Westley set the letter down. The candle moved. The room was very quiet. He had been carrying the answer for 4 years. It had been sitting in an iron box at the bottom of his luggage. She knew he had not left. Trentmarrow Bay was a village, which meant the Duke's continued presence at the Anchor was known to everyone on the harbour lane by 8 in the morning, and Katrina was certainly among them. She made no decision about it that morning. She dressed Leo, sent him to his lesson with old Mr. Hensby, and sat at her sewing table and worked. The winter light came in from the harbour window, thin and reliable. The needle moved. She did not think. At 11, Edwin came to her door. "He's asking questions," Edwin said, without preamble, because he had learned she preferred it. "Discreet ones, nothing alarming, but Bramwell says he asked about your history last night, and this morning he posted a letter through the morning coach." Katrina set down her sewing. "A letter to whom?" "Unknown. Sealed." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "He opened something last night, or decided something. There was a look on him this morning at breakfast. Bramwell's wife mentioned it. A kind of lockjaw, white around the mouth look." Edwin frowned. "You are describing a man who has received a shock." "Yes." She folded her hands in her lap. "Or a man who has given himself one. What do you want to do?" This was one of the things she valued about Edwin Crail, that he asked what she wanted to do, rather than arriving with a plan already constructed. "I'm going to speak to him," she said. Edwin looked at her steadily. "Katrina, he will investigate regardless. I would rather he hear certain things from me than arrive at them sideways." She rose, crossed to the window, looked at the harbour. A fishing boat was coming in. He saw Leo. He knows the name. He has, I imagine, spent last night arriving at a question he cannot unask. And when he asks it, she turned around. Her face in that moment was the most unguarded Edwin had ever seen it. Not broken, not soft, but stripped of its usual careful management. Beneath the composure was something old and very tired and still, despite everything, burning. The face of a woman who has survived something enormous and not yet had anywhere to put it. It lasted 2 seconds. Then she closed it like a book, with the clean finality of someone who knows exactly where the spine is. When he asks it, she said, I will tell him the truth, and then I will let him reckon with it. That is all I am willing to do. She put on her coat. Come and find me in an hour, she told Edwin, in case. She found him where she had been the morning before, at the harbour wall, looking at the sea. She sat down a foot away from him, without invitation, in the manner of someone who has decided that ceremony is a luxury neither of them can afford. You know, she said. It was not a question. Wesley looked at the water. A muscle moved in his jaw. I have suspected. Since last night, I suspect more than I knew. A pause. I found a letter. One I should have opened 4 years ago. Price. He turned. You knew she wrote to me? I knew she was going to. She told me. Katrina looked at the horizon with the level gaze of someone accustomed to looking at large, difficult things. I told her not to at first. I was not in a condition, in those early months, to depend on the possibility of you being willing to hear it. The sea moved below them. Somewhere in the harbour, gulls were arguing over something. Leo, he said. Careful. The name on his tongue like the first step onto uncertain ice. Yes, he is. He is your son, she said it with the quiet devastation of a fact long held. He is 9 years old. He has your eyes, and your grandfather's jaw, and your habit of asking questions before the last answer has finished settling. A pause. He believes his father is dead. Wesley was silent for a very long time. When he spoke, his voice had changed, altered by some pressure that had come from inside rather than outside, ground down from its usual authority to something that was not quite steady. Do not, she said, not cruelly, but with great precision, ask for my forgiveness today. I am not prepared to answer that question today. He closed his mouth. What I will tell you, she said, is what happened, all of it. The fever, the dates, the letters, Price's testimony, Aldous. All of it. She turned and looked at him fully for the first time since the harbour wall the morning before, looked at him the way she had looked at him that last night in Cavendrew Hall, with the terrible lucidity of a woman who knows she is correct and knows it will cost her everything. And then you will decide what kind of man you are going to be from this point. Not to me. I am beyond your orbit, your grace. But to him. Leo was at his lesson. He would not be back for an hour. Katrina looked at the sea and began. She talked for 40 minutes. Wesley did not interrupt once. 3 years later, Cavendrew Hall, Dorset. The long gallery at Cavendrew Hall had always been cold, even in midsummer, and Leo Voss, 12 now, and the legal heir to the Duchy of Arest Haven, restored by his father's formal public declaration and the subsequent ruin of Aldous Voss in a proceeding that had been spectacular enough to make 3 London newspapers, was in the habit of running the length of it in his socks when no one was watching, which was exactly as often as he thought. He was not running today. Today he was standing in front of the portrait of his grandmother, the one with the pale eyes, placed near the window so the light caught them, and he was looking at it with the particular considering expression that his father had recently identified with a jolt of complicated feeling as his own. She looks like you, Wesley said from the doorway. Leo turned. Mr. Crail says I look like you. Mr. Crail is correct, and so am I. Both things are true. The boy considered this with the philosophical tolerance of a child who has recently discovered that adults can hold 2 ideas at once. He had taken well to the Hall, not immediately, not without difficulty, not without several months of cautious circling and one memorable afternoon when he had told his father, with perfect composure, that he needed to think before he decided whether to trust him. But he had taken well. Edwin Crail was in the drawing room below with Leo's mother, reviewing the deed to the cottage in Trentmarrow Bay, which was now legally Katrina's property outright, purchased by her from the estate's own funds, which was how she had insisted it be managed. Hers, not given but transacted, her name on the title. Edwin had handled the paperwork 3 times, because she had changed her mind about the wording twice, and he had changed nothing in his expression except, perhaps, a degree of warmth it would have taken the careful eye of someone who knew him to detect. He had such an eye. So did she. Whether that would become something beyond what it already was, the rare, earned thing of 2 people who had faced something hard together and come out still themselves, was a question neither of them had yet answered aloud. The question lived between them in the pleasant, unresolved way of questions that do not need to be rushed. Wesley had observed it. He had said nothing, which was its own form of apology, the acknowledgement that she had the right to a future he had no claim on. The door to the gallery opened, and Copperwick came in. The old dog moved at the pace of a dog who has done his work and knows it, crossing the gallery with the mild authority of a creature that has always understood more than anyone gave him credit for, and settling himself at Leo's feet with a sound of great contentment. Leo sat cross-legged on the floor beside him, one hand in the dog's pale fur, his silver eyes still on the portrait. "Will she stay?" he asked. "Here, I mean." "Eventually." Wesley looked at his son, at the boy who had been 9 years old on a cliff path, asking a stranger for his name, and then walking away with the truth already in his pocket, quiet and clear as a held coin. And he understood that the question was not really about the cottage deed or the drawing room arrangement, or any of the practical calculus that adults used to circle what they meant. "I don't know," he said honestly. "That is her choice." Leo nodded, satisfied. "Good," he said. "It should be." He was 12. He had his father's eyes and his mother's judgment and Copperwick's chin on his knee, and that was enough for now. In the drawing room below, Catherine Voss, who had been Katrina Wells for 5 years, and who was now neither and both, depending on which part of herself she was consulting, looked up from the deed and found Edwin watching her with the quiet, unhurried attention of a man who has decided something and is waiting, without impatience, for the right moment to say it. She looked at him for a moment. Then she smiled. Not the composed, managed expression she wore for the world, but the real thing, small and unguarded and entirely her own. She turned back to the deed, but she left the smile where it was. In royal families, they say, the past never truly releases its hold. But in this family, in this cold gallery, in this drawing room below, something was being rebuilt that had no name in the old language of titles and estates. It was not forgiveness, it was not absolution. It was, perhaps, the more difficult and more enduring thing, the choice, made daily, to begin. Stories like this survive because people choose to keep them alive. If Catherine, Leo, and Wesley's journey meant something to you, please subscribe to The Plum Court. It costs nothing, but for a growing channel it makes an enormous difference. Your subscription helps ensure that the next story finds its audience, just as this one found you.